because these sections don't deal with that. The other thing is that so it's not, we derive all of our laws from the Torah, from the first 5 books. So if it's not on those first 5 books or helps us understand those first 5 books or the laws that come out of the Torah, they just weren't studied that much. The other issue is that like you and I, or I think most of us, we're interested in history. We look at history as something, some of it, like, I mean, I majored in history, so I really love history, but there are a lot of us we like documentaries. There's some aspect of history. I don't know why I'm saying this. I hope there's some aspect of history that you find interesting. I hope there's whatever the history is, there's probably something that you find interesting. I hope. Anyways, the rabbis and Jewish tradition up until recently, up until really the 1800s, never looked at Judaism as from a historical prism. Judaism was always ancient, and people realized it was always connected to the beginning and to God and to Adam and Eve and literally the beginning of humanity. But the idea that like X amount of years had passed, or that there was a historical continuity that was important because think about the power of history, which I do all the time, because they didn't look at it that way. They weren't interested in some of the things that you and I might be interested in. I'm definitely interested in, because they didn't look at history as being important. History wasn't important to them. And again, I know that seems weird to think that, like, why wasn't it? It wasn't important to a lot of people. I don't know that history is a luxury, but when you're trying to figure out how to survive, oftentimes you don't think about the future or the past. You just are thinking about right now. How do I live right now? And we talk about it today, like, you got to live in the moment. I think everyone used to live in the moment. I think like we have the luxury of saying, what's happening tomorrow? Let me look at my calendar. Nobody used to retire. I mean, we looked at one day I'm going to retire. They didn't, the idea that there was a future for most people is like, that's not what they thought about. And I think they also didn't think about the past in the same way. They respected the past, don't get me wrong. They revered the past, but they didn't see it as something necessarily of the length and span of the past was that important. The fact that the people like Abraham and Moses lived before them was important, but the fact of whether that was 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, was that the Bronze Age, or was that the Iron Age, or was that they didn't care about that. It was in the past. It happened. It was important. It was very important, but it didn't matter how many years ago it happened. And for our ancestors, the idea of Moses and Abraham living 1,000 years apart they didn't care about that. They just thought of it as generations. There was these generations before, and maybe they interacted with each other. I mean, they didn't look. That's why when we look at these stories and we go, well, how many hundreds of years apart are those people? And we go, that doesn't compute, as we do oftentimes in the Midrash. They didn't care about that. And they saw everything in the past as essentially almost like happening at the same time. Like once it happened in the past, it was in the past, but I don't care if it was 200 years or 2,000 years. It happened, and it's still to some extent relevant, and it's really relevant. But it happened, and it's that realm, and that's one of the reasons why even today within the rabbinical world, the yeshiva world, when somebody says, "Well, Rashi said that, and that happened 1,000 years ago," they don't care that it was 1,000 years ago, because they'll talk about what a rabbi said 200 years ago, and they'll talk about the two rabbis like discussing this when they didn't discuss it. They were hundreds of years apart. But for them, there's a discussion going on between Rabbi Hillel and Rashi and Rabbi, any of the great rabbis, Rabbi Feinstein, or any of the poskim, any of the rabbinical sages of the last generation. They discuss things simultaneously. They say, well, Rashi says this, well, Feinstein says that, and Maimonides says that. they all lived in different places. They all lived at different times, yet the discussions going on simultaneously in the past, or again, to some extent right now, doesn't really matter. The historical time periods don't matter. So remember that that's kind of the way Jewish history was up until recently. So when we look, and as we're going to do right now, is we're going to step back into Joshua, the idea of the historical context of Joshua wasn't really important to our ancestors. And so for that reason, there's parts of Joshua that to some extent really weren't relevant or discussed until people started doing modern excavations of Israel and said, well, wait a second, are the stories of Joshua, can they be proven? For most famously, the story we're going to read soon, the story of Jericho. Can that story be proven by the book of Joshua? And again, that's when Joshua started to become more of a relevant book, was people starting to talk about the archaeological evidence matching up with the book of Joshua. But Joshua is not read extensively in the Jewish world. There's much of the book of Joshua that people don't know of. There's a couple big scenes in it, including the Battle of Jericho, that people would talk about, but there is not a lot of the book of Joshua that is read. I will tell you that. We're also going to see that in the book of Judges. There's some sections.
Well, there's not a lot of Torah either, right? Of Joshua.
That's exactly right. And so I was just going to say that, Mike, that the beginning of Joshua that I just put up here on the page, this section is a Haftarah. And what's interesting about this Haftarah is that we read it intentionally coming up right about now, because the rabbis did understand that there was a continuity between Joshua and Moses, and they wanted people to know that Joshua stepped in and was a good mentee. What's the right word? Yeah, mentee.
Mentee.
Yeah, he was a good mentee, and that he continued in the ways of Moses in many ways. But again, what we have is, as Mike is saying, there's an issue, which is that the books that were kept as Haftarot, or the parts of the books that were kept as Haftarot, those sections that were read on Shabbat, those were the ones that would be studied more, and those were the ones that would people would reflect on and know, because at least they read it once a year. So it kind of begs the question, if you didn't read it regularly, were you going to, was it going to be in your head? And I will tell you, there are some differences between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic traditions and the Yemenite traditions when it comes to what Haftarot are read. So there are some differences, and which kind of also tells us that as the traditions developed, there were slightly different traditions that developed. The Torah readings were always the same. The Torah sections were the same around the Jewish world, but there were differences when it came to Haftarot. And so sometimes we tend to focus on the Ashkenazi in our world, because most of the Jews in America are Ashkenazi. But even that being said, amongst the Mizrahi, the Sephardic, the Yemenite, the Romaniyot, all these different communities, the Haftarot very rarely drew from the book of Joshua, which means that, again, that people would oftentimes not know the book of Joshua. They just weren't familiar with it. By far, the predominant Haftarah, the source is the book of Isaiah. So almost everything, for example, that we read in Deuteronomy, when we're just finishing the book of Deuteronomy, almost everything we read is from Isaiah in Deuteronomy. And going back to the beginning, to the very first portion of the year in Bereshit, at the very beginning, we start right away with Isaiah. So Isaiah is by far the biggest book that we read for Haftarot, for those sections from the prophets. Again, all of the Haftarot are drawn from what we call the second section of the Bible, the prophets, the books of the prophets, we call Nevi'im, or the prophets. And again, those books of the prophets, which include historical books as well as the prophets. I mean, we kind of think the prophets are prophets who are speaking prophetically. They're speaking in biblical poetry style. They're not speaking in narratives. They're not telling stories. They're giving prophecies. the reality is that we have these few haftarot that are from the books of the prophets that are historical books. The books of the historical books are Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the two books of Kings. Those books are the historical narratives that are in the book, in the section of the priests of Nevi'im, and those books are the ones we're going to look at first. We look at them, I look at them, many people look at them because they're very interesting from the historical standpoint. But from the standpoint of what we actually read during the year, very few haftarot come from there. Again, biggest one is Isaiah. We also have quite a lot from the prophet Jeremiah, who's the second longest prophet, and then Ezekiel, who's the third largest prophet, and by largest, the length of the books, the prophecies. I mean, there's 66 chapters in Isaiah. It's huge. It's an enormous book on its own. So just kind of keep that in mind. When we look at Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, there are not a lot of haftarot that come from those books. And so, again, what does it mean? It means that Jews were generally not as familiar with this. But this part of Joshua, the part that we're about to read right now, and it'll make sense to you why we read it, and it's a great time for us to do it, because in just a few days, well, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we're going to read this section, this part that we're about to look at right now, the first chapter of Joshua. We're going to read that at Simchat Torah, or the weekend that we celebrate Simchat Torah, the Shabbat after Simchat Torah. So as we're reading V'zot HaTorah, V'zot HaBracha, this is the blessing. This is the section that's read, and it is a very interesting section because, again, you'll see why it makes sense that we read this right after we read. So here you have Joshua, the book of Joshua, which literally tells you right off the bat. And if you let me just show you this real quick. If you look at the Tanakh, the sections of the Hebrew Bible, we start off with the first 5 books, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then we get into the prophets, as I said, Joshua, Judges, the Samuels, the Kings, and then we get into the prophets, the 3 big guys, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 little guys. We call them the minor prophets, actually, so I didn't make that name up. They're start here with Hosea and then go on to all of these wonderful prophets, all the way down to Malachi. Then we get into Ketuvim, the writings, which begin with the sections of the Bible that we kind of know the best. Psalms, in addition to the Torah, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs. These first 3 are all considered what we call them wisdom literature. And then we get into these other sections, which, again, the books of writings are called writings because they're miscellaneous. They are a grab bag of different things, histories, what we call the scrolls, the scrolls that we have, for example, that we read at the holidays, these 5 Megillot. We know the last Megillah the best, which is Esther. And then we, of course, then get to these last books, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles, which are the books of the Bible that deal with the Jewish people in Babylonian exile, in Persian return, when the Persians allowed us to return during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And then again, the books of Chronicles, which are very interesting because they are retellings of primarily the book of Kings. So those 2 books of Kings are kind of retold again in Chronicles. And that's the way the Bible ends, with the books of Chronicles, which is to some extent somewhat anticlimactic, especially as we've mentioned before, when we compare them to the wonderful ways that the Christian Bible finishes their book, which is, it's got an ending. Our book doesn't really have an ending. Well, we'll see. When we get to the ending, you can tell me whether there's an ending to it. Our Bible really doesn't have an ending. Our ending, the book of Revelations is an ending. This is the book of Chronicles is almost as if somebody ended the book.
It's a mid-season finale as opposed to it.
It's definitely not. Okay, it ends kind of the way Sopranos ended, where you're like, what am I supposed to know from that? Or is that really, how did it really end? And that is the way Chronicles ends. I might have been the first person who just told you the Hebrew Bible ends the way Sopranos ends, but There you go. But again, maybe there's a lesson in that, which is that it doesn't really ever end. But most people, again, do not read these sections of the Bible. When we get to certain sections like Psalms, those are ones that a lot of people are familiar with, but not, for example, as we're going to do right now, the book of Joshua. So in the coming days, and by the coming days, I mean at Simchat Torah, we read about the death of Moses. And the book of Deuteronomy ends with the words, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated, which is another very fancy and euphemistic way of saying that he was still virile. I'll say virile. I think either one's proper, but I will say virile. He was still, he still was functioning. And it's really hard not to, it's like you're talking about Moses, but that's what they're saying. His life force was still unabated, which means that he didn't have to die to some extent, but he's going to die. And God, the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab 30 days. The period of wailing and mourning for Moses came to an end. And what's interesting about that is that, again, even for Moses, they didn't mourn for more than 30 days. And again, it says that God buried him. It says he buried him in the land of Moab. And no one knows his burial place to this day. Why does the Bible tell us that? Well, a lot of speculation, again, belief that we're not supposed to know where Moses is buried, so we wouldn't turn it into a place of worship, so people wouldn't fight over it. There's a lot of possibilities of why, of why that is. But I will tell you this. We don't have a place where he's buried. I would say we don't want a place to know where he's buried, but it's not in the land of Israel anyways. It's in the land of Moab. That's what it tells us. So they're on the other side of the Jordan River in modern day Jordan. And here's the line it says, now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the Israelites heeded him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. And so there is the setup for Joshua. We already heard this. We've heard this actually in the book of Numbers. And now again, in the book of Deuteronomy, we've heard that Moses has passed his powers, at least part of his powers, to Joshua. There's a question, by the way, as we saw in the Midrash, were Moses's powers diminished? And there does seem to be a question of whether the Midrash is not, if you remember over the last couple of weeks, we read this, it's not clear. There is the theory that, again, that Moses did lose some of his energy when he passed it on to the rest of the community, including Joshua and including the elders. But there's another Midrash that we read, which is that Moses, like a candle that lights another candle, that light is not diminished when it lights another candle, that you can pass your light to someone else and not lose your energy. You can love somebody and it doesn't diminish the amount of love that you have. Okay. But there's also a sense that, no, there was a limited finite amount of energy that Moses had, and there's both possibilities. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord singled out face to face. And so then again, we have that Moses was special, but he still dies, and everybody dies. There is not, even for Moses, who God will bury, there's not an end to, he's still a person. He doesn't become not a person. For the various signs and portents that the Lord sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed before all Israel. And that is the last word of the Torah. And those are the words that end the Torah. And as we like to say, the Torah begins with God by himself or by itself. God is alone. At the end, there is Israel. That's the last word of the Torah, is Israel, the community. It's now in front of the people, and it's now the people that are going to be continuing this. So that's the last words. And you can see it's set up so that we can have the next book of the Bible. Joshua begins with these words.
Rabbi, before we start, do we know when Joshua was written? I know we always talk about the different books when they were written.
So I will tell you the theories of composition of Joshua, and for that matter, Judges. The theory goes that at least a good part of Joshua was written by a Jewish historian who may have had work that goes from Deuteronomy all the way through to Joshua, Judges,
Really?
the Book of Kings. And if that is the case, then this is the first great historian. That's Richard Friedman's theory, which is, of course, based on the idea that there was somebody who was trying to assemble the history of the Jewish people with the intention of saying, look, this is how we got to where we are here, which again, I think is a fair way of looking at it, especially since the Book of Chronicles ends where it does, which is this is how we got to where we are here and now. And so if you think about people writing history, when you finish a history book, I don't know, I can go look at my daughter's high school history books. Generally speaking, the point of the books are trying to explain how we got to where we are now. And so I think that it's a fair thing to say, you know, is there history here, and was it written with an intention? And I think that is I think it's a fair question to ask. Again, if you want to look at Friedman's book, it's called The Hidden Book in the Bible, which came out. Oh my gosh, it came out. Gosh, everything is now 20 years. Came out in 1999, actually. And it is, for those who are interested in that question of, it's an interesting question. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to prove it, and I don't know, but those questions are interesting questions. I think that they're questions that people who love the Bible can ask themselves without feeling like they're being disrespectful. I think, what?
Well, the first 5 books, we were always taught Moses wrote them. But the rest, we don't know. That's why I asked the question.
If, again, there are people who don't like this question, who don't like.
Oh, really?
They don't like this. They don't like getting into this question of who wrote the Bible.
As far as they're concerned, Moses wrote it all. God dictated it to him on Mount Sinai, including the parts that happened after he was done.
Yeah. And so exactly, people don't like this question. They get less concerned with the later books. Like, so,
right.
So if you say, well, who wrote Joshua? The traditional answer is that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. That's the deferred. That's kind of like the easy answer. So the rabbis did discuss who wrote which books. I mean, they did have discussions of it. It is preserved in the Talmud, discussions of who wrote which books. How were these books written? Did King David write Psalms? Did he write all the Psalms? Did he write other books? Did King Solomon write the Proverbs that we have, or were there other Proverbs that he wrote? And these are just his Proverbs. Was this a different person who wrote these Proverbs? So they did have these discussions of these, these things. Did King David write the book of Song? Did he write Song of Songs? Did Solomon write Song of Songs? Is Song of Songs even supposed to be in the Bible? They had these discussions, and the Talmud preserves these discussions. But the problem is that they are not historically accurate, even in the discussions that they probably had. I shouldn't say that. There's probably a kernel of truth to those, but they really were putting these discussions together kind of from the standpoint of, like, how did we get the Bible as we have it? And And this was not an issue that Jewish people asked until the last 200 years. So with that, let's take a look at Joshua. So Rosemary, would you like to start us off in the new book at a new pace? Because the pace is we're going to read. I think today we'll each read the beginning of Joshua, which for those who want to read the Haftarah for Vizot HaBracha, this is the blessing. It's a good way of doing it. So you actually read the Haftarah that we're going to be reading in about a week and a half. All right.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan together with all this people into the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads, I give to you, as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness and the Lebanon to the great river, the river Euphrates on the east, the whole Hittite country, and up to the Mediterranean Sea on the west.
Yeah, which of course, as we've discussed before, there are different boundaries of Israel, mainly the eastern boundary. How far to the east does Israel extend to? Look, the Mediterranean on the west is the Mediterranean. That's it. The weird thing about this, of course, well, the Great River is the southern boundary, by the way, which is the river that separates Egypt from Israel. The northern boundary, folks, it says right here, the Lebanon, which is Lebanon. It's Lebanon. It's at least part of Lebanon. It's the southern part of Lebanon. And of course, the Nahar Parat is the Euphrates. It was called the Parat, the Euphrates, or the Parat in Persian and Babylonian. Euphrates means the good Euphrates, which is what the Greeks called it. It's what we call it. It's in modern day Syria, folks. It is a boundary which would extend all the way into the modern nation of Syria. It's described here as the country of the Hittites, and the Hittites were an empire that was based in Asia Minor and modern day Turkey, who at the time controlled it. And at least here, it almost says the Canaanites and the Hittites are the same. It's a weird description geographically, chronologically. It also, again, kind of begs the question of do these boundaries are they ever the boundaries of Israel at any point in the ancient world? And it seems as though during the time of King Solomon, which was the largest extent of the kingdom before it then was broken into two kingdoms, yeah, there seems to have been a time when the kingdom of Solomon went pretty far north. It went into maybe not all of Lebanon, but maybe southern Lebanon, and went all the way out into Syria, because the nation of Aram was a client vassal kingdom of Solomon. And then the later kings in the north also went back and forth between controlling parts of Syria, and occasionally a Syrian king, not a Syrian king, but a Syrian king, an Aramean king, would fight for independence. And we read about that in the book of Kings. We're going to read about those things. So this boundary is a very extensive boundary. It's not the boundary that Israel talks about having if, the Golan and the West Bank and all these areas are part. It's still not as big as this. So that being said, that is the boundaries that we were promised. And here is what Joshua is told by God.
No one shall be able to resist you as long as you live. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and resolute, for you shall apportion to this people the land that I swore to their fathers to assign to them.
Yeah, and that phrase that we see right here is something that we saw at the end of the book of Devarim and Deuteronomy, where God tells, or actually Moses tells the people, all the people, Chazak v'amatz, be strong and be resolute, or be strong and be courageous. And as we discussed last Wednesday night when we read it in the Torah, It's a very powerful line. It's a powerful phrase. Be strong and be courageous. The word amatz also means kind of like self-sufficient, self-secure, have self-esteem. It is, as I mentioned last week, it is the call of the modern nation of Israel's army. You know, it is a phrase of you know, people know what it means who've read the Bible. Even people who are not Jewish know what it means. And it's become kind of a, you know, it's like I'd say it's kind of like Semper Fi, or some of the phrases that are used in the military today, in U.S. military. It wasn't necessarily said only for soldiers, it was for all the people. But Joshua, again, is told the same words, chazak va'amatz. And again, it's a nice thing to say to people who are not having a good day. And it's actually, there's a commentary here within the words.
But you must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teaching that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Let not this book of the teaching cease from your lips, but recite it day and night, so that you may observe faithfully all that is written in it. Only then will you prosper in your undertakings, and only then will you be successful. I charge you, be strong and resolute. Do not be terrified or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua thereupon gave orders to the officials of the people. Go through the camp and charge the people thus. Get provisions ready, for in 3 days' time you are to cross the Jordan in order to enter and possess the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. Then Joshua said to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, remember what Moses, the servant of the Lord, enjoined upon you when he said, the Lord your God is granting you a haven. He has assigned this territory to you. Let your wives, children, and livestock remain in the land that Moses assigned to you on this side of the Jordan. But every one of your fighting men shall go across armed in the van of your kinsmen, and you shall assist them until the Lord has given your kinsmen a haven such as you have, and they too have gained possession of the land that the Lord your God has assigned to them. Then you may return to the land on the east side of the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, assigned to you as your possession, and you may possess it. They answered Joshua, we will do everything you have commanded us, and we will go wherever you send us. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses. But the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses.
Right. And so this covenant, if you will, this agreement that that Joshua kind of now employs is connecting him to Moses. And one of the most important things was what we read about in Numbers and then in Deuteronomy, where where Moses tells the tribes, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh that wanted to stay on the other side of the Jordan, you can stay there, but first you have to fight with us on the other side. You promised it, and now you'll do it. Because the agreement that you had with Moses is still in force. So you can go back to the other side when you do that. Of course, it's a little ironic. They say we will obey you just as we obeyed Moses, because no one obeyed Moses. But you know, whatever. I mean, you get the point. They're trying to be at their best, and they're trying to show the continuity between Moses and Joshua. And when it finishes with this.
Any man who flouts your commands and does not obey every order you give him shall be put to death. Only be strong and resolute.
Yes. And so there you have the phrase again, be strong and resolute. Those words, hazak va'amatz. It's hard to hear that. First of all, it's clear that it's repeated over and over again. This idea of, reading this chapter and feeling this kind of, understanding and connection with the people, and understanding that they were afraid, but they're not alone. And it's again hearing that phrase and knowing that that's still the phrase that Israel it uses today. I guess the positive thing about it is that it kind of implies you still have a fighting chance. I think for so long, Jewish history was so far away from giving people these kinds of words of hope that it wasn't used a lot. And maybe that's another reason, folks, why the books of Joshua and Judges and Samuel weren't studied, because the idea of Jewish control of the land of Israel, or Jewish control of their own destiny, was so far removed from even being thought of, that the books probably weren't studied, because they were a kind of a very sad reminder of the fact that you have no power. You're not even close to having any power or control of your life. So again, this was a responsibility, a recognition that they were part of something bigger. And the first chapter ends there. Chapter 19, verse 19 ends that chapter. And what it tells us again is that when people read this at the beginning of the Torah cycle, the new Torah cycle, is that we can be strong and go into this next year and be courageous. And I would say that this year in particular, it helps to have that phrase kind of in our minds, that all of us should feel a sense of hopefully having some inner strength, because we're going to need it. We're going to need to be strong, and we're going to need to be resolute. Or I don't know about that word resolute. As I mentioned last week in Torah study, resolute seems kind of like an older, not King James, and not really a word that we use a lot today. But amatz really means to have that inner strength and to have that belief in yourself, not just to have physical strength, but to have internal strength. It's not like, you have to go out and beat people up because you're strong, but because you're going to have the inner strength. I mean, I think that's really the best way of.
Say resilient.
Yeah, resilience, good. It's just like, if you think about it, when was the last time you would say to somebody, be resolute? It's just not.
The Bible that Mary's looking at does have courageous in it.
It does say, which Bible is that, by the way?
King James.
Oh, that's good. Well, I think of that, the Resolute desk in the White House, right? In the Oval Office. That's the Resolute desk. It sounds like a word that, it sounds like, it's the HMS Resolute, that's what it sounds like. It's like a ship, it sounds like a great name for a British frigate or whatever. What was it? It was a I guess it wasn't a frigate. It was the HMS Resolute. And it was, I don't know, something.
It's a troop ship, wasn't it? Just a troop ship?
They used it to explore. They made a desk out of it after it. The British government made a desk into it for President Hayes. It was used for the Arctic expedition, the HMS Resolute. I don't know what it was considered, though. I don't know enough about ships to even, if I told you what it was, it just says it's a bark rigged ship. Anyway, the word resolute doesn't resound, doesn't make sense to me, but I get the point. But it is courageous. I like the word courageous or inner strength. So let's continue, because now we're actually going to get into the first chapter was kind of like a prologue. It's kind of like Joshua being set up for the continuity. Of course, there is this important story that was alluded to, which is the story of the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the Manassites, making sure that they're doing what they said they would do before, which is another part of the continuity, but got to kind of know the backstory. But here in chapter 2, we're actually going to get into a story. And I wanted to get into this story. It's one of my favorite stories of women, and in a weird way of the Bible teaching us never to underestimate and never to count anybody out. And I think that this is an important lesson for everybody to hear at least once a year, if not more. And this is the story of Rahab. I love this story, and I love it for a lot of reasons, but it makes people feel uncomfortable. It's probably another one of the reasons why it wasn't studied a lot. But anyways, let's take a look at Rahab.
Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim, saying, "Go, reconnoiter the region of Jericho." So they set out, and they came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. The king of Jericho was told, "Some men have come here tonight, Israelites, to spy out the country." The king of Jericho thereupon sent orders to Rahab, "Produce the men who came to you and entered your house, for they have come to spy out the whole country."
Okay, so let's just pause for right now about Rahab. Let's talk about her for a second. She's a prostitute, Rahab. It says so pretty explicitly. She's a prostitute. Prostitutes oftentimes ran, I now can say, the local Airbnb. They were, or the B&B. Now it's the Airbnb, VRBO. They ran places where you could get a room. People came and went, so to speak. And what's interesting about this story is that these guys, I mean, look, they go to Canaan. Now, I'm not saying that their first stop is the prostitute's house, but because, of course, our sages want you to know that they just stopped there because that's where they could stay overnight. And they could, as spies, they could have a really good cover by going to a place that people would go in and out of, and that's just what people did. So it's a good cover. There's another possibility, which is they're in Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They were there to have a good time like everybody else that came to Rahab's house, or not everybody, but maybe. So that is a possibility. Look, what's interesting about this story is that this story actually is read a little bit because it is a haftarah. Interestingly, it's a haftarah for the story of the spies in Numbers. And so the juxtaposition of the 2 stories of spies, the spies during Moses' time, and then later, the generation later, the spies during Joshua's time, you see the difference. First of all, you see the difference that the spies here actually complete their mission. There's also not 12 of them. There's only 2, which is, again, interesting because only 2 spies, one of them being Joshua himself, the other being Caleb, came back with a good report. Maybe Joshua learned, maybe it's not good to send 12 spies in. 12 spies are not going to do the same kind of thing and could come back with information that is conflicting, as it, of course, it is during Moses's time. And so maybe picking a couple really responsible guys is a good way to go. And whether or not they were there because they wanted to have a good time or because it was a smart place to go. It doesn't fool anybody. Nobody is fooled by this because the king of Jericho finds out that they're there. It says he's told that men have come here tonight, Israelites, they know exactly who they are, and they're here exactly, they know what to do. So if they were successful at concealing their identity, they'd be good spies. They didn't do that. Did they intend to go to the prostitute's house because they thought it was a good place to be incognito? I don't know. It didn't work. That doesn't mean that's why they, doesn't mean that they were going there for a good time, but I don't know. It didn't work. All I can tell you is the Bible tells us that they were found out right away, which of course ramps up the tension, the drama in this story. Love this story. Love this story for so many reasons. All right.
The king of Jericho thereupon sent orders to Rahab, produce the men who came to you and entered your house, for they have come to spy out the whole country. The woman, however, had taken the two men and hidden them. It is true, she said, the men did come to me, but I don't know where they were from. And at dark, when the gate was about to be closed, the men left, and I don't know where the men went. Quick, go after them, for you can overtake them. Now she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under some stalks of flax, which she had lying on the roof. So the men pursued them in the direction of the Jordan down to the fords, and no sooner had the pursuers gone out than the gate was shut behind them. The spies had not yet gone to sleep when she came up to them on the roof. She said to the men, I know that the Lord has given the country to you because dread of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land are quaking before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Sea of Reeds for you when you left Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings across the Jordan, whom you doomed. When we heard about it, we lost heart, and no man had any more spirit left because of you. For the Lord, your God, is the only God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, since I have shown loyalty to you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will show loyalty to my family. Provide me with a reliable sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and save us from death. The men answered her, our persons are pledged for yours even to death. If you do not disclose this mission of ours, we will show you true loyalty when the Lord gives us the land. She let them down by a rope through the window, for her dwelling was at the outer side of the city wall, and she lived in the actual wall. She said to them, make for the hills so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Stay there in hiding 3 days until the pursuers return, then go your way. But the men warned her, we will be released from this oath which you have made us take, unless when we invade the country, you tie this length of crimson cord to the window through which you let us down. Bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your family together in your house. And if anyone ventures outside the doors of your house, his blood will be on his head, and we shall be clear. But if a hand is laid on anyone who remains in this house with you, his blood shall be on our heads. And if you disclose this mission of ours, we shall likewise be released from the oath which you made us take. She replied, let it be as you say. She sent them on their way, and they left, and she tied the crimson cord to the window. They went straight to the hills and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers turned back. And so the pursuers, searching all along the road, did not find them. The two men came down again from the hills and crossed over. They came to Joshua, son of Nun, and reported to him all that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, the Lord has delivered the whole land into our power. In fact, all the inhabitants of the land are quaking before us.
And that is the way the story, well, it doesn't really end here. That's the way the chapter ends. Let's keep going a little bit further till we get to that.
Early next morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and marched to the Jordan. They did not cross immediately, but spent the night there. 3 days later, the officials went through the camp and charged the people as follows. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being borne by the Levitical priests, you shall move forward. Follow it. But keep a distance of some 2,000 cubits from it, never coming any closer to it, so that you may know by what route to march, since it is a road you have not traveled before.
All right, so let's take a pause right here and explain again the story of Rahab, at least again, to understand who this character is, what she represents. We already said there's a level to this story, which is look at what happened the last time the spies go in. Look at the report that they give. Look how it messes up all of their ability to do anything. The people lose heart. The people literally, the incident of the spies, as we say, puts into motion the entire destruction of that generation. It's at that point, after the spies come back and the people give up, that God says, none of these people will ever, not one of these people will be able to step foot into the land except for Joshua and Caleb. The only people that will be able to come in, because the spies end up doing so much destruction to the people. As we talk about in that story in Numbers in chapter 12, it is considered one of the darkest days in Jewish history. According to Jewish tradition, this is the day of Tisha B'Av. This is the first horrible thing that happens on Tisha B'Av. That this is the first horrible thing in Jewish history, which is that the people essentially show their worst sides of themselves, which again, it kind of teaches us that God can put up with people not believing in God like they do at the golden calf incident. But when they don't have faith in themselves, and when they don't have faith in their own mission, their own power, God says, I can't do anything with this generation. And here, this generation has shown itself to be more courageous and more have that inner strength, that amatz, the courage and strength that their parents didn't have. So that's one thing that we see. The other thing is we see this story of Rahab, and she is called a prostitute. There's no question that she's a prostitute. Whether the men went there for prostitution purposes, that we're not sure of. And there's differences of opinion about that, because again, it was a known fact that women who had houses of ill repute also ran the houses as places where people could stay. They were there was guest lodging. But there's something very interesting in the story that a lot of people have seen, which is here we have a story of a Gentile woman. Clearly she's not Israelite. She says so. We know it. It's very similar to the story in the sense of the setup to it as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Here you have a city where there's impending doom on the city. In this case, not, with God's help, but that the people are going to destroy Jericho. And with God's help, clearly it's going to be a miracle, but the impending doom, will Rahab be able to be spared? And so, like the story of Lot, there is this sense that she's going to die unless something's done. Now, in the story of Lot, of course, the angels take Lot and his family out of Sodom. This story is even in some ways more miraculous because the destruction is going to go on around them and they're not going to be harmed. They're not going to be, well, it doesn't appear that they're going to be airlifted, if you will. They are going to miraculously be spared while the rest of the city will be destroyed. The fact that Rahab says to the people, we know what's going to happen, and our people have already lost their morale. We lost heart, and no man had any more spirit left because of you. For the Lord your God is the only God in heaven and above and on earth below. And so here we see that there's no way, we know we can't win. And what she says goes even further, which is that I recognize that there's only one God. Which is a very powerful line, which is one of the reasons why Rahab is considered one of the first converts. If to some extent, not the first convert. I mean, if Zipporah converted when she married Moses, then she's a convert. If Osnat converted when she married Joseph, then she's a convert. But she doesn't, according to this, marry an Israelite. And what's interesting, or at least now, at this point, she hasn't married an Israelite. And what's interesting about this is that she doesn't seem to have any question that this is the God, that God is. She makes a religious proclamation, and it's based on God. It's not based on you're my people, like Ruth says later on, or again, even for the sake of marriage, that she understands that this is because there's only God. Again, maybe Bithia, maybe Bat Paro, becomes a Jew, but the rabbis really believe that she became a convert at this moment, that she literally converts to Judaism here at this moment, or whenever she said that there's only one God, that she's a convert. So she's considered one of the first converts. For sure, she's considered one of the first converts. Again, you can make the argument that she exists, she lives before Ruth, who's also one of the first converts. But again, what do we see? All of these people are women. All of these early converts to Judaism are women. The only male that we have that we know converts is Naaman, who converts much later on during the time of Elisha, the prophet. In the book of Kings, we read about Naaman converting, but this is a really special thing that she does because it's a religious impulse that she has. By the way, it also says that people have heard of the Lord. All these times that Moses was telling the people, or was telling God, look, people are going to hear about you, God. If you destroy all the people, everyone's going to know it. Well, this idea that God is concerned with his PR seems to be correct based on what Rahab here says, which is that people know about God. They know. They're all talking about what God did to the Egyptians and what God did to Sihon and Og. Everybody knows what's going on. We know what's happening. We are paying attention to this. And so this is a religious proclamation. Again, to go back to the Midrash, which I said we're always going to look at, according to the Midrash, Rahab is one of the most beautiful women in history. I mean, the Talmud says that. It's not just in the Midrashic collections. It says in Megillah, in the commentary and in the Talmudic tractate on the Megillah, that along with Esther and along with Sarah and along with Abigail, along with those women in their mention in the Bible, she's the most beautiful woman. And by the way, she was 50 years old at the time, according to the rabbis. According to the discussion of how old Rahab was at this time, she was 50 and she was still the most beautiful woman. And according to rabbinic tradition, just saying the name Rahab would make you lust after her. That's what they say in the Talmud. Just saying her name would make you go crazy because she was so beautiful. As a matter of fact, they actually went more explicit. Just saying the name Rahab will help him, not help, it would cause a man to orgasm. That's how serious they felt her beauty was. The men couldn't help go anywhere but her house to some extent. don't say they ever consummated this relationship, but all of these elements that we read about, Sodom and Gomorrah, which has a sexual element in that for sure. Well, not even a sexual element, a violent sexual element of rape, of the men saying, bring these men out so we can rape them. All of those stories exist in our minds. Being up on the roof. Who's up on the roof? Bathsheba will later be up on the roof. There's so many elements of other parts of the story of the other parts of the Bible in this story. It's so rich with other allusions, and it's such a powerful character that, you know, it's the ultimate, you know, the bad girl, you know, the woman with a heart of gold, right? You know, she's really the ultimate, you know, the ultimate example of a woman who, you know, is really such a heroic person, but she's a prostitute. And that is without a question. I mean, the rabbis can never even stretch that and say, well, she just pretended to be a prostitute. Her house was, that's what they called it. They didn't have another word. They never say that. They acknowledge that she was a prostitute. Now, here's the interesting thing, my friends. Of course, the rabbis in the Midrash don't like the idea that Rahab, after doing this heroic deed, first of all, we're going to see, I don't know that we'll get to it today, but we'll see what she does and how it works. The ribbon thing, by the way, which is also, how could I leave out the ribbon, the red ribbon, which is a symbol of fertility, right? It's a symbol of life. It's a symbol of blood. It's all those things in the red ribbon, the crimson thread. But what they didn't want her to do was disappear. And so they have this wonderful story that Rahab ends up marrying a man from the tribe of Judah named Salmon. And who is Salmon? He's none other than Boaz's father. So just like we have the story of Boaz then marrying Ruth, who has a somewhat dubious ancestry in the sense that she's a Moabite woman, we have a story that Boaz himself is the product of this union between Salmon, who we read about his father. We know who he is from the tribe of Judah, but we have this idea that Judah, the tribe of Judah, which even goes back to Tamar and the story of Tamar and this illicit relationship that Judah has with his daughter-in-law that begets Peretz and Zerach. The whole tribe of Judah has this weird kind of, is she a prostitute? Is this a prostitute? This is a prostitute. Then you have Ruth, who comes out of the Gentile community of Moab, who then winds up having a baby who's King David's grandfather. I mean, this is craziness. And you consider that the rabbis knowingly wrote these stories by way of explaining, by way of trying to give us some context of these people. They didn't like the idea that Rahab disappears. And the idea that this woman with this background, even with this background, not only doesn't disappear, but it's also then by their association, the ancestor of King David, the ancestor of the Messiah. The ancestor of the Messiah is also then Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute. I don't know. The story, when you think about the layers to this story and what they're saying here, it's quite brilliant. It's quite powerful. And again, never look at somebody like they're worthless. Never look at somebody like they're, because of their lifestyle or what decisions they made up to this moment, that you give up on them. Because again, this woman ends up, at least according to possibly by the rabbis, becomes the ancestor of King David. And they didn't have to say that. All right. So again, she has, I do want to point out one thing I don't want to leave. She does have to do something. She has to bring her father, her mother, her brothers, her family. She does have to do that. She has to, it's not like God's going to protect them just because they're Rahab's family. She's got to do it. She's got to bring them together. And if they don't do it, we're not responsible. We're signing this waiver. The waiver is they're not in the house, ain't on us. Got to follow the rules. Again, reminds us a little bit of being in the house. What happens when the angels strike Sodom and Gomorrah with blindness? And she agrees to it. Let it be as they say. They have to follow the rules. Any of my family is going to be saved. They got to follow the rules. So let's get back to the story. Okay.
And Joshua said to the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will perform wonders in your midst. Then Joshua ordered the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and advance to the head of the people. And they took up the Ark of the Covenant and marched at the head of the people. The Lord said to Joshua, this day, for the first time, I will exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they shall know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. For your part, command the priests to carry the Ark of the Covenant as follows. When you reach the edge of the waters of the Jordan, make a halt in the Jordan.
Wow. Okay, so God says, I'm going to make sure everybody knows that you're the man. And I'm going to do it in a way that'll be very dramatic. And you can already start to see the setup for this. When you get to the waters, get to the Jordan, you've got to stop in the Jordan, by Yarden, inside the Jordan. Here we go.
And Joshua said to the Israelites, come closer and listen to the words of the Lord your God. By this, Joshua continued, you shall know that a living God is among you, and that he will dispossess for you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The Ark of the Covenant of the Sovereign of all the earth is advancing before you into the Jordan. Now, select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. When the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord, the sovereign of all the earth, come to rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan, the water coming from upstream will be cut off and will stand in a single heap.
Yep. So it's not going to exactly be the same thing as the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea parting, but pretty good. It's still going to be pretty good. We still get to see God doing some miracles. Maybe again, not as big as the Red Sea. It's only the Jordan River. In those days, the Jordan River was more than it is today, but it's still not the same. Not the same as the Red Sea.
When the people set out from their encampment to cross the Jordan, the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were at the head of the people. Now, the Jordan keeps flowing over its entire bed throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the bearers of the Ark reached the Jordan and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark dipped into the waters at its edge, the waters coming down from upstream piled up in a single heap a great way off at Adam, the town next to Zaratan. And those flowing away downstream to the Sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, ran out completely. So the people crossed near Jericho. The priests who bore the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood on dry land exactly in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed over on dry land until the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan.
So it's not the same as the Red Sea, obviously, but you can see that it's pretty powerful. The people got to see it. The new generation who didn't get to see the Sea of Reeds got to see it, and it's a powerful miracle. It's a chance for these people to see something pretty amazing, right? They get to see God doing some miracles. Of course, the ark is part of those miracles, and the people get a taste of what their ancestors, their parents and grandparents got to see. which is a miracle in front of them, in front of their eyes. So there's a miracle right there in chapter 3 of Joshua. The miracles are continuing. Maybe not as big as they used to be, but they're still continuing. And again, it happens in a very dramatic way. Waters stop up there. They don't just, the water doesn't go down, the level doesn't go down, it stops.
When the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, select 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and instruct them as follows. Pick up 12 stones from the spot exactly in the middle of the Jordan where the priest's feet are standing. Take them along with you and just deposit them in the place where you will spend the night. Joshua summoned the 12 men whom he had designated among the Israelites, one from each tribe, and Joshua said to them, walk up to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan, and each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, corresponding to the number of the tribes of Israel. This shall serve as a symbol among you. In time to come, when your children ask, what is the meaning of these stones for you? You shall tell them, the waters of the Jordan were cut off because of the ark of the Lord's covenant. When it passed through the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And so these stones shall serve the people of Israel as a memorial for all time.
So what's interesting, of course, of this is that we have something that we saw in the book of Deuteronomy. And we, of course, know about it from Passover, which is your children are going to ask you questions. They're going to ask you, questions. And there needs to be, you're going to help them learn from in certain ways. And one of them is that they're going to see these things. They're going to see this pile of stones, and they're going to know that you're going to tell them what happened here. You're going to tell them that this is the place where God, where God literally performed this miracle of the Jordan. And of course, it's because of the ark being there too. It's not just that God did it, but that the people also get to, know that the ark that they have has that kind of power. So this is a good, it's a good lesson. It's something that, the people can actually see and experience. And if we go a little bit more.
The Israelites did as Joshua ordered. They picked up 12 stones corresponding to the number of the tribes of Israel from the middle of the Jordan, as the Lord had charged Joshua, and they took them along with them to their night encampment and deposited them there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, at the spot where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they have remained there to this day.
Yep. And so they actually did that. They put together the stones for the tribes and for the stones of remembering this miracle, etc. They were able to do this here.
So is there a place in the Jordan where there's 12 stones?
No. It's a good question. We've looked for it. People have thought this is where the spot is. We know roughly where it is. We've never found this this place. It's not any place that we've ever seen. So unfortunately, cannot be shown. Yep.
The priests who bore the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until all the instructions that the Lord had ordered Joshua to convey to the people had been carried out. And so the people speedily crossed over, just as Moses had assured Joshua in his charge to him. And when all the people finished crossing, the ark of the Lord and the priests advanced to the head of the people. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh went across armed in the van of the Israelites as Moses had charged them. About 40,000 shock troops went across at the instance of the Lord to the steps of Jericho, for battle. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him all his days, as they had revered Moses.
Again, question of how much they revered, but Moses, but there's a continuity. So again, they're going off into battle against Jericho. They should feel pretty strong. They have the ark with them. They have the tribes that promised that they were going to fight. A lot of people, and we're going to have. Hopefully, we'll get right here to the Battle of Jericho.
The Lord said to Joshua, "Command the priests who bear the ark of the pact to come up out of the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up out of the Jordan." As soon as the priests who bore the ark of the Lord's covenant came up out of the Jordan, and the feet of the priests stepped onto the dry ground, the waters of the Jordan resumed their course, flowing over its entire bed as before. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan. He charged the Israelites as follows: "In time to come, when your children ask their fathers, 'What is the meaning of those stones?' tell your children, 'Here the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry land.'"
Again, this is this place at Gilgal. This is where the stones actually, go on the other side. So it is important to know that this place at Gilgal, we're not sure where it is. Haven't found stones, haven't found where the Jordan stopped, but it gets back to this land, this idea again. This is so your kids will know. This is where, so your families will know where this happened, that it happened, that God did miracles for us, not just in the wilderness, but now here as we crossed in, and God is still with us. Now, keep in mind that there's this question of, again, now we're in our homeland. Is this relationship with God? Did God do God's part? Did God get us to this promised land? And now we've crossed. Okay, so God did a miracle and we crossed in. Now we're in. Is God still going to be with us? That's the question that some of the Israelites might have been asking themselves. Or now, are we on our own now? Okay.
"For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you crossed, just as the Lord your God did to the Sea of Reeds, which he dried up before us until we crossed. Thus all the peoples of the earth shall know how mighty is the hand of the Lord, and you shall fear the Lord your God always."
Right. So again, a sense of PR for God. Now this chapter is kind of short, but then it'll lead us to chapter 6, which is the actual battle with Jericho. So here's what happens.
When all the kings of the Amorites on the western side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the sake of the Israelites until they crossed over, they lost heart, and no spirit was left in them because of the Israelites.
And again, there seems to be a parallel, again, because they're synonymous. Amorites on the western side of the Jordan, all the kings of the Canaanites to the sea, near the sea. It seems to be, again, all of this area in southern Israel is, people are giving up hope, right? They're starting to, now even more so, now the Israelites are here, and now they know the Jordan River, but like God's still with them.
At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and proceed with a second circumcision of the Israelites." So Joshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Gibeath Ha'aralot. This is the reason why Joshua had the circumcision performed. All the people who had come out of Egypt, all the males of military age, had died during the desert wanderings after leaving Egypt. Now, whereas all the people who came out of Egypt had been circumcised, none of the people born after the Exodus during the desert wanderings had been circumcised.
Now, by the way, if you thought that they weren't circumcised, in Egypt, it kind of says that they were circumcised in Egypt. But the people that were in the wilderness didn't get circumcised. There's no good explanation for why that is. I mean, you can make the argument that, they didn't want to get hurt or sick in the wilderness, but they were there for 40 years. It almost seems as though they were waiting to come into the promised land to be circumcised. To be circumcised in the land was going to be an act of covenanting as they came in. Look, this place is called Gibeah or Givat Ha'aralot. This is the Hill of Foreskins. That's what Givat means. It means the hill, the mound of foreskins. That's what they called this place. It was called the Mound of Foreskins. That's what the place had happened. That's what happened.
Didn't the Egyptians circumcise?
Yeah. So from what we know, the Egyptians did circumcise. Now, maybe was there a different kind of circumcision? Possible, but it does seem like the Israelites wanted to circumcise now, but it means that there were people who were in their 20s and 30s who were getting circumcised now, who were born in the wilderness, who never were circumcised. Now, again, I guess you could say if they were born in Egypt and they're only in their, if they were little kids, I don't know. It seems as though, again, this is an important thing to do, to circumcise themselves when they come into the land. Not easy for adults to have this done now. All right, let's read this part.
But he had raised up their sons in their stead, and it was these that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, not having been circumcised on the way. After the circumcising of the whole nation was completed, they remained where they were in the camp until they recovered. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So that place was called Gilgal, as it still is. Encamped at Gilgal in the steppes of Jericho, the Israelites offered the Passover sacrifice on the 14th day of the month toward evening. On the day after the Passover offering, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the country, unleavened bread and parched grain. On that same day, when they ate of the produce of the land, the manna ceased. The Israelites got no more manna. That year they ate of the yield of the land of Canaan.
Yes. So the manna ceases the day that they started eating food from the land of Israel. The land of Israel food now is what they will be sustained on. No longer will they be eating manna. God doesn't need to take care of them anymore. It's really quite wild. And that is something the Bible tells us in Joshua is, again, one thing comes to an end as this new reality. They're no longer being provided for by their parents. They're now on their own dime. They're starting to earn their own livelihood and their own food and their independence. And they get a new miracle, which is the food from the land of Israel.
Once, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him, drawn sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and asked him, "Are you one of us or of our enemies?" He replied, "No, I am captain of the Lord's host. Now I have come." Joshua threw himself face down on the ground and, prostrating himself, said to him, "What does my Lord command his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host answered Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so.
We're going to finish there. We don't have time to get into the capture of Jericho, unfortunately, now. But I will tell you, of course, this is very reminiscent of Moses, right? Of Moses being told to remove his sandals from his feet, for the land that he's standing on is holy. So now Joshua sees an angel. Now, again, as the rabbis like to point out, maybe it's the same angel, right? The angel of the burning bush was in the burning bush. And now this angel, maybe Michael, the angel that fights for us, is now here in more of anthropomorphic form, right? He's now as a soldier. Joshua is completely enraptured with what he sees and falls to the ground even before it's not the angel told him to bow down. He says, remove your sandals, but he doesn't say, I'm God. But it clearly is, the angel's not named. I want to make it sure that, like the assumption is it's Michael because it's the captain of the Lord's host, or again, it's God's army, the Lord's heavenly hosts, that it's Michael. But doesn't remember in the early parts of the Bible and actually the Hebrew Bible, we don't get angels named. The angels' identifications are not given. It's much later, after, who knows, coming into contact with other traditions that were more into angels than we were. It doesn't mean they didn't believe in angels. It says there's an angel here. We've read about other angels already appearing to Abraham. It's not like they're not mentioned, but not mentioned in the kind of detail and with the names that they are later on in Jewish texts. So this is Joshua seeing a personal, individual miracle. This is not a miracle in front of all the people. The people had the Jordan River miracle, but there's another miracle here too. So God is still doing miracles in the book of Joshua. I do want to point that out. And I do want to point out that God has not abandoned the people. There's miracles happening for them in the promised land, but things are changing and now they don't have manna anymore. So one miracle has been pulled away, which is that they're not getting manna anymore. And so we've read the first 5 chapters of Joshua, and you can see, so far the people are behaving themselves pretty good, which is wonderful. They seem to, they're following the rules. They're doing what they promised that they would do. They're doing good spy work, maybe not successful spy work, but they don't come back with bad reports. They maybe go to prostitutes' houses, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're consorting, but they might be, who knows? But they don't seem to be messing up yet. They seem to be doing the right thing. They go through a mass circumcision, which is not an easy thing to do, and they seem to have their right frame of mind. I just want to finish up with a story that I've told people before, so bear with me if you've heard this story, and I apologize, but it's hard for me to read the book of Joshua without going back to one of my favorite and most powerful stories of Joshua, which again goes back to this words chazak ve'amaz, be strong and be courageous. Don't be terrified or dismayed. And I tell this story because it's impossible for me to read this chapter and to read the beginning, as you heard that the phrase was repeated a bunch of times. It's the way that we, if you will, as I said, it's the haftarah for the Zod HaBracha, and so we kind of begin and start the year with these words, to be strong and resolute, to be strong and courageous, and especially now. But I want to share this one quick story that really happened. Didn't happen to me, but it happened to somebody that I know and that some of you know. 17 years ago, we had a terrible tragedy in our synagogue. We had a young boy who was, it's hard to believe it was that long ago, but he would have, he would have been almost, it was 2003, so it was 18 years ago. Joshua Sparagi, who was named after Joshua, and he drowned in Castaic in a terrible jet ski accident with his uncle. And he drowned, and it was a terrible loss to his family and to all of us. And it was really one of the hardest things that ever happened to me. And it was not long after I had come, after I was the rabbi. And I've been friends with Bonnie for a long time. I saw Bonnie at the temple, his mother, 2 days ago. She was playing mahjong. And it was a terrible loss to the family. He had a younger brother, Jeremy, and Jeremy grew up in our temple and was bar mitzvah, but he lost his brother Josh when he was just a kid. Josh, so Josh drowned, and it was terrible stress on the family. I'll just say that. And Josh's father, right after Josh died, after Shiva was over, he went on a drive. He went up north, and he wanted to kind of get out of town and just have a moment to reflect and to try to figure out how he's going to continue on, because he was very close to Josh. And so he was at a gas station, stopped at a gas station, and he was very messed up, as he told me. And people could see how messed up he was. You could visibly see how sad he was. So he was at the gas station, and somebody came up to him from another car and said, "What's wrong?" And he told the story about how his son died. And Gary told the story, about, how he's trying to rebuild his life and try to figure out he's going to continue after losing his son. And the stranger that he met at the gas station just said to him, listen, this is a terrible loss, and told him, he's also dealt with some struggles. And he said, I don't know what your faith is. I don't know what you believe, but the Bible's given me a lot of comfort, a lot of strength. And so he gave Gary this pendant that was around his neck, and he gave him the pendant and said, maybe this will give you some strength. So he handed it to him, and it said, and Gary didn't know a lot about the Bible. He wasn't, a Bible scholar by any stretch of the imagination. He calls me and he says, I just got this necklace. It says on the necklace, I charge you, be strong and be resolute. Chazak v'amatz in English. Do not be terrified or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. It had this line from Joshua, from the book of Joshua. And so Gary called me and he said, what is this, from the Hebrew Bible? And I go, yeah, it's from our Bible. It's a Jewish book. And he said, the guy gave this to me because I needed it, because I needed to be strong, to have courage, and to not give up. He says, I don't know where I was going, and I don't know, what would I couldn't figure out even what to do. He says, but Rabbi, he says, I got this necklace. He said, it says Joshua 1:9. And he said, the guy didn't even know that my son's name was Josh. And he was 9 years old when he died. So, it still gives me chills when I say it today, because, it's a coincidence, whatever people, it was a coincidence his son's name was Josh and that he was 9 years old, and that this line from Joshua was on this necklace. But, at that moment that person gave him that necklace, it's strange to think how people become like angels. And, when Joshua sees an angel, he knows he's seeing something special right away. But, the people who give us strength and who help us, sometimes we know that they're angels, and sometimes we know that they're sent from somewhere special. But sometimes we don't really know. And the book of Joshua has just told us within a few chapters, sometimes these people are angels because they look like angels. Joshua could see they're angels. And sometimes they might be a prostitute who saves your life. You don't know. You don't know where that help is going to come from. And sometimes it can come from a person at a gas station. So folks, chazak v'amatz, be strong and courageous, and go into this new year with good courage, good faith that we're going to make it together. So thank you everybody for starting this journey in Joshua and being together. And again, dedicate this to one Josh Sprague. All right, everybody, have a great couple of days as we get ready for Yom Kippur. We also like to say Amseinu, like we say Hayom Ta'amseinu. We say in the prayer Hayom, on this day be strong. So we have a meaningful fast and an easy fast, but one that will hopefully give us strength. So when you see the word Amatz or Amseinu, remember that that's the idea, to be courageous. All right, everybody, take care. And thank you, Rosemary, for reading. Stay good, everybody. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.